Okay, welcome back. We are going to finish our talk up with electron transport chain, part of the cellular respiration talk. So, we have now converted glucose into CO2, and now we have some electron carriers that are making their way over to our step 4, the electron transport chain. So let's look at step 4 and see what we do with all of these electrons. So this slide shows us what we came out with from all of the reactions. In glycolysis, we came out with some pyruvate, our 3-carbon molecule, a little bit of ATP, and some electron carriers. We had our 2-carbon molecule, a little bit of CO2, and some electron carriers from pyruvate oxidation. And then in the citric acid cycle, we breathed out the rest of our CO2. We had a little bit of coenzyme A. We had a lot of electron carriers produced from here. This one says 6. So again, remember, depending on who you ask, it's 6 to 8. Don't quite worry about that number. Not going to drill you on what number that is, because there is debate scientifically. And a little bit of ATP. So this is a good summary to quiz you on what came out. But really, now we're going to take all of these electron carriers and move them into our final phase, the electron transport chain. And that's where we're going to make our most energy, make our ATP. So this is a quick overview of what the electron transport chain, or you might have heard it or might hear it known as oxidative phosphorylation. There's that word again, oxidative. What does oxidation mean for electrons? Are we adding or removing? Okay, I'll let you think about that one. Okay, oxidative phosphorylation, oxidation, loss of electrons. Okay, so the electron transport chain contains cytochrome proteins. There are several complexes in there that makes a chain that transports electrons. That's right. The location of it is in the intermitochondrial membrane. So in that little intermembrane space, not the outer membrane. The electrons are brought in by the electron carriers. Remember our NADH and our FADH2 from the other parts of cellular respiration. So they enter in, and that's where all of our electrons come from. And they come on in. And then redox reactions release energy. remember what redox is. Reduction and oxidation reactions. They are moving electrons. And then hydrogen is pumped out, creating a gradient. So, to go over that again, we have proteins that are stuck in the inner membrane. We get our electron carriers that come in. They bring all these electrons. Then there's some redox reactions. We remove the electrons over, and then hydrogen is pumped out, creating a gradient. So what does this actually look like? It looks like a redox relay, like a relay race, where the baton is actually electrons that are moving in a race. So here are our cytochrome proteins. Whoa, what is happening here? Here are our cytochrome proteins that we talked about that are stuck in our intermembrane. And here are our electron carriers that come in. They are carrying our electrons from our food. Remember, we did all of those reactions through cellular respiration. We ate our food, we breathed in our oxygen, then all of those reactions happened, and we had our electron carriers finally make it. So we broke down the glucose, we got all of those carbon molecules broken down, we broke all those bonds to get all those electrons out, and now we're carrying the electrons on the NADH. So we're carrying the electrons, and they come in to our proteins. And then we get this basically redox relay. So what does redox mean? We are moving our electrons. We're going to remove the electrons from our carriers. Finally, they've carried the electrons far enough. So we're going to move the electrons, and it's now going to be NAD plus. And that reaction is going to pump out hydrogen. And the electrons can move along and create another reaction, moving electrons further off of the other electron carriers. And then we move our electrons through our other protein complexes again and pumping out more hydrogens. And that's the transport chain. It's called a chain because there are several proteins in a chain, and the electrons get to move through the chain. You'll notice the last one, receiver, is hydrogen and oxygen. We pump out. Last receiver of electrons is hydrogen and oxygen, and we make water, and we get more hydrogen pumped out. oxygen is the final electron acceptor. So again, there's our oxygen. Why we need oxygen in our cells. We breathe. We need it. It is our final electron acceptor, accepts those electrons from all of those bonds that we broke. Without oxygen, the relay stops and we can't make water. So now we get all these hydrogens outside. We get all these hydrogen ions outside. We've moved all of our electrons off of our electron carriers, and it's created this proton gradient. We've pumped all of our hydrogens into our membrane space, and our oxygen has received our electrons. Now what are we going to do with all of these hydrogens out there? What's going on? Where do they want to go? They've created this hydrogen gradient. What is going on with them? Where do they want to go? Well, they go to our very special endpoint. Our proton or hydrogen positive ions move back through our last protein complex, which is ATP synthase. And just like it sounds, it synthesizes ATP. So the proton motive force energy from the proton gradient, they basically all fall through this ATP synthase to create ATP. So the force from all of these protons out there make this motor move to create ATP. So we get all of these protons out here, and then they're like stuck and they have all this energy, and they're going to go really, really fast through here, and it's going to make this motor move and create all of our ATP. So let's think about this for a second. This is our final end point. This is what we wanted. We wanted all of this ATP. We want this cellular energy. This is where we make all of our ATP. This is where we get all of our boatload of energy. We got a little bit in the beginning, but this is where we're going to get masses and masses of ATP that our cells are going to use for us to talk and listen and grow and run. This is where we get all of our energy from. So let's think about this for a second. How did this happen? We basically moved electrons from molecules. We took all of our electrons from bonds that we broke off of glucose that came from carbohydrates, and we took all of our electrons and they moved through these protein complexes. And these electrons moved their way through, and the power of their movement caused protons to pump outside of the inner membrane space. So we're pumping out our hydrogens. So they're still stuck in the mitochondria. We're not pumping them out into the cytosol. We're still inside the mitochondria, just stuck in between the membranes. Here. We're in the inner membrane space. So we pump them out. So all that energy from the electrons, we're pumping out the hydrogens. Our electrons turn into water. And then it's these protons. We get this like proton gradient in between our inner membrane space in the mitochondria. Get all of these protons out there. They're just hanging out going like, I don't want to be out here. It's not really great out here, guys. I don't want to be out here. There's too much of us out here. I need to make more of like a homeostasis. And so it's that proton power. We were making all of these electrons. You think like, oh my gosh, electrons do everything. But then here come the protons, like at the last second, at the end of the relay race, the protons come in and they like steal the show, right? They're like, oh, all this time we were harvesting all of these electrons, and then it's like the protons at the very last second, they're like, oh guys, I don't really like it out here. I'm gonna steal the show. And then the protons are like, okay, we're out here, and then we're gonna whoosh, we're gonna start the motor that makes ATP. And that's how it happens. So we harvested all of these electrons to then pump the protons out. And then the protons are actually what makes the motor move to make ATP. And then, well, how are we making ATP? What's happening? Okay, so we're moving a motor. It's a big protein complex. And remember, we're making ATP. So ATP is a cycle. I hope that you remember. Where phosphate is added to ADP. And we need a little bit of push to do it. So that's what is happening with the protons. So we add a phosphate and we need to bond it to the end to make that 3-phosphate molecule ATP. So we're starting here with the 2-phosphate that was used. They're used up in our cell. Basically, they're kind of floating around. It was used somewhere else. Maybe our cell moved or did something, and now this ADP molecule is floating around. It's like, okay, well, I need to go back to the mitochondria so I can get recharged. And then it floats around and it comes back, and it comes back to the electron transport chain, and it gets recharged, and it adds the final phosphate back on it. So then it can get moved back out into the cell and used for energy again. Make sense? So it's a 2-step process to make ATP in oxidative phosphorylation. The electron transport chain is a bunch of redox reactions where we're moving electrons along. And then chemiosmosis, which is producing the proton gradient that powers the ATP phosphorylation. Which is a lot of chemistry in there. There's a lot of chemistry that happens in here. But that is the basics of what's happening. and it's exciting. That is how our cells work. So let's take a minute and watch this cool video on on ATP synthase and how it works.
So where does your ATP come from? Deep inside your mitochondria, rows of molecular motors generate ATP, the molecule essential to all life on Earth. Enzymes bring together reactants to form a chemical bond. So where does your ATP come from? Deep inside your mitochondria, rows of molecular motors generate ATP, the molecule essential to all life on Earth. Enzymes bring together reactants to form a chemical bond, converting mechanical energy into chemical energy. A ring of enzymes work in step, creating 3 molecules of ATP with each cycle. Inside the molecular motor, a rotating axle powers the sequence. The axle is attached to a rotary molecular motor, moved by the force of protons pushing from the other side of the membrane. A difference in proton concentration propels the molecular mechanism. Synthesis of ATP. ATP drives biochemical activity inside your living cells and is a key building block of DNA and RNA.
Okay, so what do we end up at the end of the electron transport chain? We end up with, we need our electron carriers, our NADH, our FADH2, our O2, and we end up with our NAD without any electrons. We end up with our water, and then we end up with our energy, our whoppers. We end up with about 32 to 34 molecules of ATP. Again, biology is squishy. It's not always exact. It's not always a perfect reaction. Sometimes we lose things in reactions. Sometimes our cells get tired. So it's not always perfect, but we get out a lot of ATP out of the electron transport chain. It is a whopper amount of energy. So remember, we made 2 ATP in glycolysis, 2 in the Krebs cycle, and we get around 36 to 38 per glucose molecule. So that is a lot of energy that we are getting per glucose that we consume. So lots and lots and lots of energy and bonds that we break, electrons that we move, and things that we end up with. So remember, this is what we are doing. We are eating. We're consuming glucose. Glucose comes from many, many different sources. not just simple carbs and sugar. You can get glucose from many different things. And we get oxygen from breathing. Very essential. If you don't breathe, think of what can happen, how your cells can shut down quickly. And then we get out CO2, right? Think of where in the reactions the CO2 come from. Where does the CO2 come from? Think in your mind. And then we also get out water. Where did you see the water in those reactions? And then energy. Energy in the form of ATP. And where did we see energy come out? So remember, we are taking our 6-carbon molecule and we're breaking it down into single carbon molecules, or CO2. And we're using oxygen to do it. And the goal is to get out energy. There's a lot of steps in between of breaking bonds, moving energy involving electrons and electron carriers. But this is the simple overall reaction. And this is what the overall reaction looks like if you were to look at it simplified, where our glycolysis happens out here in the cytosol, and we get 2-pyruvate that move into the mitochondrial matrix. We also get our electron carriers that move on down the line to our electron transport chain. And then we move through into into pyruvate oxidation. And that gives us some more electron carriers and breaks down breaks our carbon molecule down even further and moves it into the citric acid cycle, where it breaks down our carbon molecule even further, and we saw it move into CO2. And we have some ATP out of here and some ATP out of here. And finally, we move all of our electron carriers into oxidative phosphorylation and our electron transport chain, and we get our whoppers of our ATP. Again, this is a different slide, different numbers of ATP on this one as well. So we get out different amounts of ATP depending on which textbook you're looking at, because biology is squishy and it's not always perfect depending on who measured it. So you don't have to know the exact amount, but you do have to know how many carbons are breaking down and how much is where the electrons are moving and where they're moving to, and that there's a good number of ATP produced and a small number of ATP produced in the other steps. Okay. Think about where were the oxygen, the CO2, and the water involved at on these steps as well. And finally, why we breathe. We breathe in, think about it. As your lungs fill with air, where is all that oxygen going and what is it doing? It's moving to your cells. And as you breathe out, what happened to that oxygen? Now, what is your cells doing? Cellular respiration. Your cells are respiring. Your cells are breathing, but they're also converting things into energy using your oxygen and all of the food you ate. So here are all of your learning objectives that we covered, so many of them that we covered over cellular respiration. These are on your slides and they will be posted. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and how it was broken down and that you will be able to review each part individually. Thank you for watching. Have a great week.